Hey guys, MoiDawg here, and today we're going to be going over some graphics settings in Squad. A few of you guys have asked on both YouTube and Twitch what my current graphics settings are for Squad, and what they can do to better increase their FPS and performance while you're in-game for either recording or if you're just playing yourselves. Before we do that though, if you look at the top right of your screen, you can see that there's an FPS counter up here. If you don't know how to do this, press tilde, which is in the top left of your keyboard, then type in stat FPS. And that's going to either bring it up or take it down, depending on what you have. Always have this counter up when you are trying out new settings, so that way you can see just how the FPS is being affected with what you're doing. I will also say, for the purposes of this video, I have my FPS uncapped at 240, with this is as high as Squad will let you go. However, when I'm actually streaming or recording, I have this capped at 90. I do have an i9 9900K and an RTX 2070 Super. So if I'm being honest, I could probably sit around 120 and I'd be fine, but 90 I've found is pretty good for both visually how the game's going to look and also performance on my computer, since I do have a single PC setup. If you're recording, you're streaming, if you run into any choppiness, any screen tears, anything like that, I'd first come over to your maximum FPS and lower it down, start at 60 and then work your way up, so that way you could see just if in-game in Squad you can mess around with these settings without working on your OBS or maybe your even drivers, anything like that. Usually you can fix recording issues with these maximum FPS settings. If not, you'll then have to go outside to OBS or whatever you're using to record. As you can see here, it's always going to cap your FPS whatever you set it at, so it's kind of a set it and forget it. Like I said, if you can get over 90 FPS like I currently have, you know, we'll be looking at here anywhere 90 to 100. If I'm looking down, I can get even more than that. But that will have effects on your performance if you are doing other things than just playing Squad. Now, my current settings, these are the settings that I record, stream, and just play Squad in. These are my current settings. So I have it on full screen. Gamma and screen sharpening are default, so 2.2 gamma, screen sharpening at 0.5. And then I have anti-aliasing on temporal anti-aliasing, or TAA. Super sampling off, effects on cinematic, view distance, shadows, and textures on epic. I have distant shadows on, bloom on, ambient occlusion on, and eye adaption on. So if you just wanted my settings, here you go. But if you guys do want a little bit more insight in what each of these settings do and how it affects your FPS, I'm going to go through each one of these so that way you can kind of tweak it for yourselves. Now first, with full screen borderless windowed, to be honest, you're always going to have better FPS if you can do full screen. You're going to have better performance in general, but I haven't noticed too much of an issue. You can see our FPS is, I mean, if anything, it's about the same, but performance-wise, especially if you're running other things, I would highly recommend to just stay in full screen here. Gamma, we'll cut here in a second to show you guys on the training range what gamma looks like, but this cannot be adjusted in-game. This is essentially your brightness for the game itself. In the past, this has been used and abused to play around with fog. You know, tank battles, spandrels, things like that could kind of see through fog and hit vehicles like 2,000 meters away. Screen sharpening we'll touch here in a second with anti-aliasing and super sampling. But graphics quality, if you just want to set up, I mean, this is kind of the set and forget settings, you know. If you have any game, you just press the low, medium, high, whatever your benchmark will do. If you run benchmark here, it just gives you an automatic settings, and this is what it picked for me. Epic, TAA, super sampling off, everything on Epic. So I'm actually not far off on what the game is recommending here. I would recommend just keep it on custom. I mean, you're going to move to custom whenever you start clicking around, but really find the settings that best work for your rig. So anti-aliasing, I'm going to turn everything off here just so you guys can see. Turn this back to how it was. So with no anti-aliasing, if you notice, the trees especially has a lot of fuzz static. You can see each and every pixel. This kind of, in my opinion, it's very hard on the eye. It makes it very difficult to just keep looking at. You know, if I'm in a vehicle, if I'm running through these trees, if I'm in a helicopter, if I move around here, you can probably see this kind of hurts my eyes. So with anti-aliasing on, it essentially makes all of these pixels softer, and it makes it just easier for you to see. As you can also see, we're going to stare right here. As you can see, with 100 FPS with temporal anti-aliasing on, we turn it off here, we're essentially at the same FPS, maybe getting 5 FPS increase without anti-aliasing. In my opinion, you're going to want to basically sacrifice a 5 FPS so that way you can remove the static and just kind of pixelation for these. A lot of players say that they like it without anti-aliasing because they say even with FXAA, it's still a little soft, but you see the pixels. They say it's a bit easier to see players out in the distance. Like we can see this Russian soldier running right in the middle of the screen, right to left. He's just underneath that shadow now. But if you have anti-aliasing on, they say it's a bit harder to see. Now this might be true. It might be a bit harder to see players and vehicles and things like that. But in my opinion, it just makes it so much easier on the eyes, and it just looks so much better when you have anti-aliasing on. Now, super sampling, this is where you're going to really cut into performance. Super sampling can also affect the pixelation of your game. So we'll turn this off again. So with super sampling, if we go all the way from off to 2.0, we can see that we're taking a huge FPS hit. We are getting some of the performance like FXAA, so it is kind of blurring a little bit of these pixels, but our FPS is dropped from nearly 100 FPS to just under 50. We're at 45 FPS. So as we do move around, not only are we getting that pixelation from the lack of anti-aliasing, but we're also going to probably get a couple screen tears, and we might even run into some issues when we have smoke and explosions that then have huge FPS drops that just make it really hard to play in general. As we move quickly, you can see this doesn't feel very good on the eyes, and so I would always recommend to keep super sampling off and instead play around with your anti-aliasing, because this just looks a lot better. Now, I've seen on Reddit and some other people posted in the forums and also the Steam page to play around with some FXAA and maybe go 1.2.5 super sampling. You know what? You can do this. In my opinion, it doesn't look much better than just having super sampling off, but your mileage will vary depending on what rig you have. If I could recommend anything, see if you like the blurriness or the, to be honest, I think it's crisper, the crisp look of TAA. Do not use any super sampling, as this will really drop your frames, and see if this works on your end. Just for showing you guys exactly how much FPS you're going to be giving up. Once again, we're at about 100 FPS here with it off. 1.25, we've just dropped about 10 to 15 FPS. 1.5, we've dropped another 20 FPS. 1.75, we've now dropped another 10 FPS. And then we're finally down to, we even got into 30s and 20 there for a second with other vehicles in. So, I mean, going from 2.0 to off, from 40 FPS to almost 100 FPS, you know, I think it's pretty obvious that I would like to keep this off and keep anti-aliasing on. Now, for our screen sharpening, I've turned anti-aliasing and super sampling off. Screen sharpening, you can also have the same type of effect. If we have 0 screen sharpening, just so you can see the difference here. Between graphics quality, everything right now looks a little sharp, even with it off all the way. When we turn it up all the way, you can see it looks, in my opinion, it looks about the same. Some people say that with maybe like a 0.73 screen sharpening, FX, and 1.25 super sampling, they get this just perfect combination where they can see pixels and everything. I haven't had much of a difference at all. Playing around with super sampling and screen sharpening, in my opinion, you might get some performance increase by having this completely off and just adjusting with your screen sharpening to however you like the look of it. But I have been playing with TAA on for so long that anytime I mess around with the screen sharpening and anytime I mess around with super sampling, it just looks very jagged and pixely, and it just looks bad. Especially when you're going over a lot of trees and you just have a lot of assets being loaded on the screen. The screen sharpening itself will not affect FPS performance, or if it does, it's pretty minimal. So you can play around with this if you do wish. However, when you have anti-aliasing on, you know, it's really not going to do much. It's really when you want to play around with your super sampling, which once again, I don't recommend. Now for textures, typically when you play a video game, you say, okay, the textures, if I keep this low, I'm going to improve my FPS. That's not really the case in Squad. As we can see, we're about 90 FPS here with our epic textures. If I put the textures to low, we're about the same. If anything, it didn't change. You might have gotten 1 FPS difference, but the textures are not where you're going to make your FPS. I honestly would just load in whatever textures you like the look of. Some people like a little lower quality textures because it's a lot easier to see enemies. But I like to make it look as realistic as possible. So with high textures, you know, the models look good compared to the lower textures. So I'd always like to keep this as high as possible. And especially knowing that you're not going to get much of an FPS increase, I'd say at the very least try to get this to a medium or high setting, just so it looks a little bit better. Shadows, however, is where you're going to get a lot of FPS. I currently have, let's go over here, so we have a lot of trees here. So I currently have shadows on, and what is going to confuse a lot of people is that this says, for our distant shadow check mark here, it says enabling this may affect performance. We're at about 90 FPS, so I'm going to take this off. As we can see, the shadows are gone. We've gone up about 10 FPS with all these shadows here, so we are gaining FPS without the shadows. But if I take this on, and then I turn shadows to low, we're going to also have kind of the same effect here. So our distant shadows, in my opinion, it's really weird how they have it, because they say only this one affects performance, when in fact this one will also get some performance increases as well. So with this on and with my shadows at low, I'm still getting the same performance increase as having shadows on epic and distant shadows off. I like shadows. I think it makes the game look a lot better. Distant shadows, however, can definitely, as we can see just right here, you can see just how different the woods look with these shadows on. If at the very least you want to have some shadows, I'd have this ticked off and maybe move your shadows down to medium, so that way you can still see some shadows, but you're going to have a good 10 to 15 FPS increase, as we can see in the top right. I mean, it's peaking almost to 110 just with your low shadows off. Now all the way up to maybe 110, 115 with low shadows and no distance ticked. Just because you tick this off doesn't mean you're going to get the best performance. If you're ticking this off, I'd recommend remove this all the way down to low anyway for the best performance. Now view distance, I haven't noticed too much of an issue with view distance. I'm going to turn everything on low so we can get a little bit better example here. Everything on low, and then our view distance, we're going to start with low, and then remove my distant shadows just so we can get a baseline here. With this, we can see it looks very low quality, but we're anywhere from 90 to 100 FPS. If I turn on view distance all the way up, you know, we're about 90 FPS as well. It's not really going to affect too much, but you know, if you do have any issues with your rig just rendering things in the distance, because obviously mine doesn't, being a 2070 Super, you might want to play around with your view distance. At the very least, I'd say your medium should give you a few FPS increases and cause some performance increases as well. But just know that if you are playing around with this, it's worth it to lower your shadows as well, because these shadows are really where you're going to get the FPS increases. The view distance, through all of my toying around with, view distance is very minimal, but when you add in the shadows and distant shadows, you're going to get that 10-15 FPS jump that you're looking for. Now for your settings between bloom and motion blur, this is more or less whatever you want. The only one that will affect performance a little bit is ambient occlusion. We can see here we're about 100 FPS, and we're looking at some of these shadows here. Ambient occlusion affects how the shadows and lighting are actually rendered. So if we're at 100, 110 FPS, it's probably going to be roughly the same. Yeah, maybe a 5 to 10 FPS increase with all these shadows. This one will be very map dependent. If you're on a map like Gorodok where there's a lot of shadows, you might see some really big jumps. I like the look of ambient occlusion. It just gives the depth a little bit more to these shadows. Here, just so we can see another example. So this is with ambient occlusion on, shadows on epic, everything like that. When we move ambient occlusion off, you can see it looks just slightly brighter. And then especially if we remove all of our shadows and remove ambient occlusion, we can see it makes it really easy for you to see through these woods. So no shadows, no ambient occlusion, no distant shadows. Everything is just very easy to spot. This might make it easier to see people. I think it just looks bad. So if you add the ambient occlusion back on, we can see it gives some depth a little bit to these little bushes and stuff. We can see just the bottom of these bushes, and where you'd guess a shadow is where ambient occlusion adds. But you will be losing some FPS. If you're not going to use distant shadows, if you're not going to have your shadows on anything but low, there's really no point to have ambient occlusion, since you are going to be sacrificing 10 to 15 FPS just for, you know, the bottom of a bush. This will make it very easy to see. I would strongly recommend that if you're going to be streaming or recording this game, do not sacrifice the shadows for your visibility. If you're just playing it, or maybe you want to be a little bit more competitive, I guess you could play around with these settings. But in my opinion, I'd rather miss someone because of all these shadows than sacrifice the look of the game. Because in my opinion, this looks so much better and so more realistic than removing all of these shadows. Now for bloom and eye adaption, bloom is supposed to add a little bit more brightness to the screen. We can see it's very minimal, but it affects the lighting. I don't know if you can even really tell in the video, because I can barely tell just looking at my screen right now. But we're at 120 FPS just looking at the scene here with bloom on. When I'm removing bloom, we're not really changing anything. It's going to make buildings, especially buildings that are really bright, give a little bit more brightness and look a little lighter. It's going to make the buildings, the assets, everything in game just reflect more of a realistic lighting environment with this bloom. I think it looks just more natural with it on, but to be honest, you're probably not going to notice much of it. I would just leave this on. You're not going to have any performance decreases for the most part with this on. Now for eye adaption, I leave this on. It's supposed to cause your lighting to kind of react as if you were in a dark environment, moving into a light environment, how your eyes would actually react in real life. I haven't noticed too much of a difference with it on or off. However, some players really can tell that if they have this off, it puts them at more of an advantage because they don't have the brightness adjusting on their screen. But I like this setting just because it's how your eyes are supposed to act in the real world, and I want this game to look just as realistic as possible. Lens flare as well, as we're looking up at this light. We can see the lens flare. That's essentially your camera. As you can see as I move right and left here, you can see the little lens flare going up on the screen. You're really not going to get any other FPS increases, decreases, whatever with this. This is just your own personal preference. Personally, my eyes don't get lens flares in the real world. I am not a camera, so I turn this off. And the same goes for motion blur. Motion blur, if you're doing real cinematic edits, you might want motion blur. But as we can see, to me, this gets me nauseous. It hurts my eyes. I don't really like this. I know it can look really good, especially if you're trying to record maybe some no HUD footage and just really get immersed. But it's not only it hurts my eyes, but it is also very hard to see enemy players and things like that. So if you're moving quickly and you're doing motion blur, it's going to cause you, in my opinion, to overlook things that you might have seen if you remove this blur. Once again, this isn't really going to affect any performance, and it's more just a personal preference thing. Now for the fully load textures, default is off. Only turn on if you have at least 4 gigs of VRAM. In playing around with this, I have 8 gigs of VRAM, and I don't know if this is just a messed up setting or something isn't loading correctly. This typically overloads my VRAM, and I haven't had good performance increases just by using the fully load textures. This might be dependent on your system and what you have going on in the background, but the fully load textures, you might lose up to 10 FPS if you have this on, but in my experience, I've kept this off because I start having rendering and encoding issues when I do have it on, since I have so much going on in the background that is not squad. In my opinion, don't play around with this. Play around up here in your graphics quality, anti-aliasing, super sampling, and then see if you can even add this. It's really not going to affect too much in the long run, but if you are doing kind of this admin cam shots, it is nice to have your fully loaded textures on, because that way some of these graphics in the distance will just have fully loaded and it won't kind of look like it's loading as you pan across. All right, so I am going to be loading in and out of Kraken so you guys can see some gamma differences. So that way you can see just how the game will look at your default gamma, which this is 2.2, and remember this is something that cannot be changed in-game, and how the view distance, shadows, all that type of stuff will look when you play around with your gamma. All right, so this is low gamma. We have it as low as it can go at 1.80. You can see it looks a little bit darker. It's actually kind of hard to see comparatively in the shadows and areas like this. If you do have your shadows off, though, I will say this will obviously make it easier, but overall, low gamma basically is going to be darker in general. Now this is at as high as gamma you can get. It is, this is 2.50. If you were to have a bit more fog on this map and make it a little bit easier to see, but in general, this is just going to be the brightness of your screen and in-game. Once again, if you were to remove your shadows, it's going to make it a lot easier to see, and then even more when you drop in some or remove the ambient occlusion. It just makes it super, super bright. It can make it maybe a bit easier to see players, as we see this player running across here. If you compare it with all your epic settings, we'll turn everything back on. It can be difficult to see that player. The gamma is going to also cause everything to be brighter in addition to the removal of the shadows. So do know that if you do play around with this for one map, you'll have to disconnect and reconnect in order to get it back on a map that may be darker or brighter. So I would always recommend to keep this at the default 2.2. Now the last setting I'd like to go over is your field of view. I have my field of view set at the default, which is 90. Some people have gone up to like 100 and 110 and things. But to be honest, this makes it look a little bit too much like a fishbowl to me. As we can see, if we increase the field of view, it's obviously going to be, I can see a lot more, but you do get that fishbowl look. I don't really like that look at all. It kind of makes me nauseous. However, you know, you do you. If you like being able to see a little bit more, then you can increase this field of view. But do know that if you do play around with this field of view, it's going to cause everything to get that fishbowl look. Additionally, if you do have your field of view super high, like we have it right now at 120, it's going to make these scopes very hard to see because your field of view is not as close as it was before. So just to compare, we're at 90, and I can actually see down this scope, whereas if I increase this to 120, it's going to be very far away. You can still hit things, you know, if you're still used to this, I mean, go for it. But it just makes it very difficult, in my opinion. I'd rather sacrifice my left and right if I can see a little bit more clearly on my field of view here when I ADS. Now, I also want to note that if you are running into some issues where there's some large explosions, a lot of things are happening on screen, and you're getting a lot of freezes or crashes, you might think it's a graphical issue, but it's actually an audio issue. The audio quality, you can see here, it's either low or epic. I currently run epic, but if you are running into a lot of problems and you think it is a graphical issue, it might be worth trying to see the low audio quality and see if that does anything. Do note that this does require a restart. The audio quality itself, as on epic here, I notice you have much better directional audio. If you do have it on low, once again, it does require the restart. It's very hard to tell where people are talking, where shots are coming from, but ultimately, if you are crashing and you're having problems like that, then it's worth a shot doing the low audio and seeing if that fixes any of your problems. Well guys, that kind of wraps up my squad settings, as well as going into a little bit more detail of what these squad settings can do to your FPS and what it looks like in game. So if you do have any questions, please post them in the comments below. I'll try to get to as many as possible. And if you did like the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more squad content, and we'll see you next time. Peace.